Releasing Trauma is sponsored by the Global Association for Trauma Recovery. The Global Association for Trauma Recovery is a social impact organization serving as a resource for survivors and their families, dedicated to facilitating change by spreading trauma-related awareness and thus creating a more trauma-informed world. Learn more at gaftr.org. Welcome to Releasing Trauma, a Survivor's Podcast. I am your host, Tracy Osborne. I am a survivor of emotional bullying, rape, sexual assault, domestic abuse, and grief. After losing my husband in 2019, I set off on a new adventure to help other women release their trauma and create a life they can cherish. Each week, I will feature a guest expert or a survivor to share their stories, tips, wisdom, and more. The goal is so that you can take away even just the smallest nugget of information you can use in your life right now to make a change, and to remind you that you're not alone. There is life after trauma, and you can move from victim to thriver and create a life you can cherish. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. I am your host, Tracy Osborne. With me today is Elisha Halpin, and we are going to be talking about releasing trauma through embodiment and how you can heal from PTSD. So Elisha, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Well, I'm thrilled to have you here. It's going to be a good topic. But I always like to start off the show with having our guests tell us a little bit about their story. So why don't you tell us about your story?
Yeah, so many stories, right?
Yeah, which one do you choose?
Totally, which one do you choose? So yeah, I think for me, one of the things that kind of spurred me on my journey was I had a lot of trauma responses that I could identify without a lot of trauma identified experiences, if that makes sense, that I wouldn't have I couldn't necessarily say why I had these things coming up. So that kind of spurred me into deeper work and to understanding. And, one of the aspects that I really have come to understand and really use in my work is understanding about generational trauma and what's been kind of passed down through our families. And I'm of mixed race, and I say that I have just about every oppressed lineage kind of possible in my system. And so, a lot of aspects of displacement and colonialization and famine and all of these aspects that aren't particularly my identity's lived story, but yet I responded to life as if they were. And so that really, I was very interested in understanding how to support myself, but also how to support others inside of experiences that they were going through when they're responding as if they've had it. And then later in my adulthood, I've had traumatic experiences such as a plane emergency crash landing, and
Oh my gosh.
that was fun. And I've had asthma attacks that have turned into near-death experiences. So I have had that sort of experiential trauma. But it was really those came after sort of me even understanding that I was carrying traumatic responses in my body. Yeah.
Just a little bit of trauma, not much. Just a smidgen.
Which I think is actually pretty normal for the modern person. I don't feel that I'm very special in that.
Right. We all have trauma at varying levels, and nobody's one trauma or multiple traumas is worse or better than anybody else's. They're unique and they're personal.
Yeah.
So you obviously had PTSD, I would imagine, at least from the plane crash, if nothing else.
From the plane crash, I did. Yeah.
So, tell us about that. What was it like to have PTSD, and how did you get over it?
Yeah,
or how did you heal from it?
Yeah. It didn't surface immediately. And so, I really felt like my resiliency took over in the moment. I was able, like after we landed and with no engines and the planes and like in the middle of a field and we have to get bussed out and like, but after all of that, I was like, I just got on another plane. And it wasn't until a little bit later that I started having severe anxiety, and I didn't put it together right away that this was related. I'd never had what I felt was a panic attack before this. I definitely had felt anxiety before, but I'd never had that aspect where I was hijacked and I could kind of witness myself and I was acting erratic and I felt like I was going to die. I was completely in terror. And I hadn't experienced that before the plane crash. And so I really had no idea what to do. And I would act very erratic on planes. Just be very, very awkward for a while. Yeah, but I won't embarrass myself with any of those stories in this. It took me a while to kind of get with the picture that like this was bigger than just, because so many people talk about, oh, I'm nervous flying. And, it's sort of like, well, I hadn't been nervous flying before, but now I am. And all of these things. It took me a while to sort of be like, there's something larger going on here, Elisha, you need some support. So when I finally got with the picture and was able to stop kind of shoulding myself, like I should just be fine. I was fine before. I really began to understand the complexity of what I was going through and have, some compassion for myself. And it was actually through that journey that I found neurosculpting and heard Lisa Wimberger, who's the creator of neurosculpting, which I'm now trained in and use with everything. She was talking about healing herself from severe seizures, where she would actually like flatline. I'm losing the name of the type of seizure that it is, but she would literally just like, yes, thank you, grand mal seizures. And she flatlined in front of her daughter and was like, this can never happen again. And she'd been a meditator for many years, but she realized her meditation was actually supporting her disassociation. And she began to look for a different way of meditating, and that took her into studying the brain. And thus what was created is neurosculpting, which is a process of beginning to get the brain and the body to tell a different story and to be on the same page around that story. And it's a very somatic based process, at least in the way that I do. It's a very somatic based process. And so I began to work with neurosculpting and then to go into studying it. And that was how I was able to heal myself. But it took time to work through that, partially I think because I didn't fly every day, so my exposure rate wasn't super high, but it became this sort of determination from this really supportive way, not from this forcing way, but this sort of like, I will choose to heal this. And I think that was a big part of my journey, was it was not something that I wanted to carry on anymore. And I've had other parts of my trauma where it's like, well, it's not really bothering me that much. So, but this one was really something that I was like, I don't want to carry this, and I don't want to continue to be, to have that hijacking system. I think that for those who've had PTSD or have severe anxiety, when you get hijacked and you're no longer in control, it's very scary to sort of live in that way. And especially if you're not quite certain what's going to trigger it. For me, I became claustrophobic in a way. Like I couldn't walk down long hallways. Sometimes even the sidewalk, like looking down the length of a sidewalk would set me off. And so, recognizing that this is affecting the quality of my life and I don't want to have it continue, was a real motivator for continuing to work with the neurosculpting each day to get my brain to recognize a new program, so that the cueing of my body could shift.
Tell us about neurosculpting. What is that?
Neurosculpting is a 5-step process, and it really begins with induction or down regulation. So we want to get that limbic system, that hijack. We want to meet that place. and began to bring some safety and regulation into that aspect, and began to get the cueing. So it can go, top down or bottom up. So sometimes that cueing of the induction, we need to get the brain sending the information to the body, and sometimes we need to get the body sending information to the brain. So we work both ways in the induction. So we're working with breath, we're working with some imagery, and we're inviting different body cueing. So we'll do a body scan, but not in sort of a hodgepodge body scan, so that the brain's having to jump from place to place. And one of the biggest aspects of neurosculpting is we want to get the brain into cross toggle talk, so that we've got the right hemisphere firing and the left hemisphere firing at the same time. So we're bringing logic and linear thinking to creative and artistic thinking, and counting and looking at colors. And one of the ways that neurosculpting works as well is that it's really about bringing curiosity or novelty. So we learn in three ways. We learn through fear. We learn through fear. We learn through repetition. We also learn through curiosity and novelty. So I guess I'll say four ways. And we have found that, most of us are wired towards fear-based learning. And if we can shift that, as not just in our neurosculpting process, but across the board, towards a curious way, so that our framework moves towards curiosity rather than fear. The way I look at this is that, do you live for questions and answers, or do you live for inquiry and open exploration, right? And most of us are trained, and most of us find our safety in looking towards question and answers, but that's going to be fear-based learning, because we're always going to be afraid of getting it wrong or not having the answer. And if we can invite curiosity, that's great. And then novelty is sort of when we experience something new and it begins to blossom inside of us. And so that's a really beautiful thing to bring into our practice as well. So some of the curiosity we use in neurosculpting to help tell a different story to our brain is, thinking of the craziest things that you can, or how would you paint with your nose, or just silly things that kind of bring that the brain goes, wait, what? And it just disrupts some of these patterns. And so, curious thinking and novel thinking can be a disruptor to our fear-based thinking. So in the steps of neurosculpting, we come through this induction, and then you begin to tell yourself a different story. And we're going to do that through color and texture. And so the whole premise is built upon neuroplasticity. It's allowing the brain to fire and wire in a new way, and doing that enough times that those synaptic fields become very strong, and they can become even a default, so that we're changing the habitual patterns or the automatic responses to something that we want it to be. And as you go through this process of telling yourself a story, and then at the end of the 5 steps, we do a somatic cueing. So most of the time we'll do a little tapping, or some people will make a gesture or touch a specific place in their body. And so just anchoring it in to remind ourselves that it's the body that has to hold this memory now.
So I'm disappointed that there's no play involved.
There's no.
No,
there totally could be.
There totally could be, yeah.
There totally could be. Yeah, so what's interesting about me is I use neurosculpting in just about everything I do. I don't often teach the straight meditations. So I use the 5 steps in how I create somatic play and how I create my somatic embodiment work, because I found that if we can come through this inductive place, in that middle ground of telling ourselves a different story, it's really open for me, and sort of how much we can bring in and our other modalities that we would want to maybe partner and pair with. And so, so there's beautiful people. I mean, there's beautiful meditation, straight neurosculpting meditations, and I've done some of those, but I often just use this as my framework for really life. I'm just like, can I get inducted? Can I bring myself into some regulation? And can I notice what I want to shift the story to, right? Can I shift that to something that allows me to be more curious and open? And then can I anchor that into a somatic memory that invites me to be present?
Yeah. So in a way, it's re-sculpting your brain and how your brain works. Kind of along the lines of neuro-linguistic programming, only a little different.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, any of these modalities that are built on neuroplasticity, um, they're inviting us to really take the power of the human body into our own hands and use it as a superpower rather than staying victim and letting it continue to be our kryptonite.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, when you talk about somatic play, somatic embodiment, what does that mean?
Mm-hmm. For me, somatics comes around this aspect where you, inside of your own immersive experience, are the receiver and the giver. You're the teacher and the student. Your body and your experience is the laboratory, and it's the whole point. And so when we go into a somatic experience, what we're curious about is, how do I feel? How do I respond? What is this bringing up for me? What are the memories attached here? So there is no way of getting it right or wrong. There's just this opportunity to really be inside of our immersiveness. And so, my work all comes from this lens, this aspect of allowing our full sacred self to be inhabited in our body. And I feel like what's been robbed from us inside of most of our journeys with spirituality or religion is this understanding that my individual experience is the truth. It is what's important. And I am the only one who can be an expert of that. So my Gnostic experience. So for me, my Gnostic journey in spirituality and my somatic experience in terms of healing and performing and all of the other things that I've done, they're really one and the same. It's me coming into my own direct experience and trusting that and learning from that. And it's not that I can't get feedback. It's not that I don't need a teacher who helps to bring a container and an edge to that, but that I have to be willing to be the authority of my lived experience. And if it feels unsafe for me, if it feels uncomfortable for me in a way that's not sort of me resting in my comfort zone, but really my nervous system saying this isn't good for you, then I have to be willing to trust that and follow through. And I have to be able to have the confidence to, support myself and to say yes and no from this internal place of knowing. And I feel like somatics is part of that journey for us.
So does, all of this, the neurosculpting and the somatics, does that release the trauma from a cellular level as well? Or is it just really focused on the brain?
I think it's more focused on the brain. I work with breath work specifically as a somatic practice that's going to do more of the cellular work. Yeah. So I feel like that we have to, we want a top-down approach. And so that's going to be more of a meditative approach or a story-based approach. And then we need a bottom-up approach if we're going to work through kind of that cellular aspect. And for me, that's going to be much more breath work, often tremoring, some type of body-based practice that's going to shift more at the cellular level.
Okay, gotcha. So how can people just kind of dive into this? Do they have to study it? Or, is there stuff that you can tell them to do, like, right now over the podcast?
Yeah, I would say the first ways to start are, one, to just always be willing to be curious rather than thinking I think so many of us have, sometimes it's conscious, sometimes it's unconscious, the story, I'm doing it wrong. I'm wrong, or I don't know enough. And I think start off, be curious, but also be willing to, you're the expert of your life. You're the only one living it. So take that responsibility to be the creator and the author of it. I think too, something that we can all stand a little bit more of is some forgiveness and compassion to ourselves. And, being willing to, we're often willing to give that compassion to others, and turning that inward and giving ourselves some compassion and some breaks and, some rest and some support.
Mm-hmm.
And third, I think develop a very strong relationship, even before you begin maybe working formally with a breathwork teacher, but be willing to develop a relationship with your breath and to really understand how your regulation gets affected by breath. I mean, if you understand your own breath cues, you pretty much know everything you need to know about how your inner system's working. So, and if you develop then breathwork practices, you can have all of the tools you need to shift that. And I think if we really start with a baseline of breath, then shifting that mental story or context is going to be much easier, and it's going to go much faster, no matter what modality we're using.
What do you mean by breath cues?
So if you notice, if you've got check-ins built into your life and you sort of become aware, wow, I'm breathing in my chest, that's going to be cueing you about something. Oh, I'm holding my breath. That's telling you something about what's going on with your regulation, right? So if our breath is not deep, if it's not soft, and if it's not light, then we're probably dysregulated.
Gotcha.
If we're unable to breathe in and out through the nose with, nice, easy cues. So all of those kind of things, if we understand how to develop a strong baseline of breath, and then we understand what's happening, the breath will automatically shift when something's going on. And what we can do is we can trust that shift to be the information we need about what's happening. So it allows us actually to meet our regulation without going into the story of like, oh, I'm so stressed, or oh, this is so hard, or oh, here this is again. It's like, oh, I'm holding my breath. I don't need to talk to myself about all the reasons I'm holding my breath. I know that, but can I in that moment notice I'm holding my breath and go into a process of releasing that breath? Then from the release of the breath, I might need to do more story work, or I might need an additional practice or something to help regulate me. But I think it all needs to begin at that base of breath.
Okay, that makes sense. That makes total sense. Well, Elisha, thank you so much. This has been really fascinating. Can you tell us how to find you online?
Yes, Elisha Halpin, Elisha_Halpin on Instagram, and ElishaHalpin.com on the web.
Awesome. Thank you. And listeners, you know the drill. We'll have all her contact information in the show notes. Just head over to releasingtraumapodcast.com, find Elisha's show, and all her contact information will be right there for you. Elisha, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really, really appreciate it.
Thanks, Tracy, for having me. It was great.
Listeners, thank you as always for joining in, and we'll talk to you in the next show.